All right, welcome to Outside Our Walls podcast. This is just again just to reiterate, we do this because we want to make sure that we are hearing from voices outside the walls of our church, and I guess as we've walked through these last number of weeks, there's just been a number of things that we've been hitting and talking through. Today, I have a friend of mine with us, Brian Howard. He is the president now of Acts 29. That's your title, right? President?
Well, Matt Chandler's still the president, but I'm the executive director. So I probably should correct that just in case Matt watches this.
That's probably that's probably good. Okay. Executive director. I couldn't remember the title.
Right.
But one of the things that I'm excited for everybody here to hear from you, Brian, is because we've been friends for probably 5 years now, I guess, ish.
Yeah.
4 or 5 years. Brian has worked with me and Aaron, both of us closely through pastor, just coaching us through pastors. And actually one of the things that I wanted to bring the church into, just because I think it's helpful to make connections for you as church members to hear how Brian's affected and impacted you all before you hear from him. Even one of the things is just as we've been planning a church, integral in helping me get to that spot of having, I guess, the courage to do it, in reinforcing just gifting, but then also just bringing us into Acts 29, just really important that way for us. And one of the reasons I do this podcast is because in a side way, because of Brian, and we're going to hear from you in a second, man, but just so that you hear this, when we were trying to, back when I was a associate pastor, we were trying to go to 2 services and trying to figure out how in the world to do that. I thought we should get a secondary opinion. We need to get somebody that knows what they're doing, because we have never done this. And I wanted to reach outside of our circles. I got a lot of counsel to stay inside of our circles because that, there was a culture, and there was a little bit of a fear that maybe Brian doesn't know the culture. And I just thought, well, if we know how to build a house, let's just say, or a church with wood, and why would we go to other people that know how to build this with wood when maybe Brian knows how to use stone or brick or metal work to help build this thing? So let's get outside of the walls of this church, which really has led me to this podcast, because it was by getting your wisdom, just hearing this is really helpful to hear from people that just don't think the same, because you're not in our church. You're in your own church in Los Angeles. You've been in Acts 29, you've done coaching. So anyway, this podcast in some ways is indirectly, you're related to that, at least the idea of it. So thank you for being a part of our lives. Thanks for being here on this podcast to serve the church too. Tell us a little bit about yourself, man. Tell us about your pastoral career. Tell us about what you've got going on with coaching and these kinds of things. And then we'll get into some more specific questions.
Well, I should start by saying, if you're tuning in from Arizona, I'm from Arizona, grew up in Tucson, the real and better Gilbert. And so I love to joke with my friends in the greater Phoenix area about Tucson versus Phoenix. And you're probably winning times about 4, except in the basketball world. But anyways, all that to say, love Arizona, love your church. I've been to Gilbert many, many times, and I've worked with several of your leaders over the years, and so I'm thrilled to be able to connect with you guys today as well. I grew up in Tucson, went to Amphi High School, a prominent high school in the city of Tucson, played a little sports in my time there, and went to University of Arizona to begin with, ended up joining the military along the way and doing a stint at Desert Storm. So part of my story is that, some military background, disabled veteran now, did a stint with the Marine Corps in Desert Storm. And when I got serious about walking with Christ, which was during my military years, I grew up in a Christian home. When I get serious about my walk with Christ, I wanted to go to a Christian college, ended up going to the Master's College in Los Angeles 30 years ago, essentially. Out of there, became a pastor, was a youth pastor for a number of years at a big mega church, became an executive pastor in Orange County, continuing to do youth ministry, worked with led a lot of kids or saw a lot of kids come to Christ during that era, and eventually planted a church almost 20 years ago now in Los Angeles County, in the Los Angeles area, and pastored that church for between 8 and 9 years. And during that era, I began to do a lot of coaching. So I began to walk alongside pastors. By that point, I was in my 30s and spent from 30 to 40 in that church. And the church grew to be a larger church, and I became more and more connected across the country in terms of coaching, just walking alongside pastors, helping pastors think through how to do things more effectively, how to reach people missiologically. Mm-hmm. And also during that time, because I planted a church, I became more and more passionate to see more churches planted. So we partnered in church plants. We joined Acts 29 back in the early days. We helped plant churches. We sent out church planters. We helped fund church plants, and just were really involved in the church planting world, which ultimately led me eventually to the Acts 29 role that I'm in today. I've coached hundreds and hundreds of pastors and worked with a lot of churches and worked with leaders all over the country across denominations, generally in our greater theological context. But for several years now, have invested much of my effort in Acts 29, which served as the chairman of the board for 5 years, led the Western United States for several years, and just recently stepped in as the new executive director of Acts 29. So that's a bird's eye view of, say, 30 or 40 years of history. I live in Orange County, California. You probably know where Orange County is if you're from Arizona. I have 2 kids at Cal Baptist who might be going back to college this fall, and I have 2 kids in high school, a senior and a sophomore. So here we are, living through this crazy time right now in Orange County, California.
Yeah, especially where you are, COVID America. I mean, Arizona, our cases are spiking. We were just talking, but you guys are the same way. But you guys had it way worse at the beginning. So it's by you guys going up it's scary for sure. Yeah. We don't just 1 minute here, but you also work some with the Lakers. I know you've done that in the past anyway, right? You've done some work with them. What's your take on basketball? We playing or not? What's the deal? As of June, what is it? June 16th? We playing basketball this year or no?
What I know is probably, excuse me, it's probably the same that most of you know. It looks like 22 teams are headed to Orlando, and some of the guys that I know that are in those inside meetings, it looks like everybody's headed to Orlando for 3 months, and so
all right,
we'll see. So
I'm holding you to it, man. You said it. We'll
see. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Anchor's a part of Acts 29. We love being a part of Acts 29. One of the things, and as you've talked about ways that you've served in Acts 29 over the years, Tyler and Lindsay and Tiffany and I went to a conference this past year, and just really benefited, I think, from your strategic leadership, which I actually want to talk to you a little bit about in a little bit about just strategic leadership and even leadership and pastoral ministry. I think you have a lot of really good things to say about that, but just benefited from that. Even we're talking about diversity and all that stuff now, I feel like there was some steps being made through a number of guys in Acts 29, but even in the West, just from the conference itself, I think that's something that we're working on. I really do appreciate, one of the things I appreciate about how you've led. What is for church members here at Anchor Church? What is Acts 29 about? What are we jumped into? Tell us why it exists. And these are a lot of questions, but even church partnerships. Why Acts 29? What's the joy of being a part of it? Why does it exist? What's the mission?
Cool. Well, if you've never heard of Acts 29, Acts 29 has been around about 20 years or so, started by a group of folks 20 years ago, essentially as a kind of a collaboration to see more churches planted. And, 20 years ago, what Acts 29 was a small little movement, started in between a church in Florida and a church in Seattle. And it grew to be 30, 40, 50 churches. And then more and more churches were planted. And then say fast forward 10 years into the movement, and I was involved in the earlier days. I was on the board a long time ago, but fast forward, say a decade ago, and Matt Chandler, and I may not have the timeline exactly right, but in the past 10 years, Matt Chandler ended up stepping in, and some of the early leaders ended up stepping out, and Matt Chandler has been a really healthy presence in Acts 29. Even when Matt Chandler, I came into Acts 29 at a similar time to Matt Chandler, and so I've worked with him for many, many years and known him for a lot of years. So there were a lot of things going on in Acts 29 all over the place. And then Matt stepped in and basically said, hey, I'll help lead this forward. And that began the global expansion, and so Acts 29 now, 20 years after its start, and there have been articles written in Gospel Coalition and I think maybe Christianity Today, different things about Acts 29, but essentially we're now in 55 countries and in 33 primary languages. And so what Acts 29 is, essentially, it's about 900 churches or so across the world. And there's a collection of networks. So there's a Latin American network where there's 25 or 30 churches and growing. There's a Brazil network. There's a Europe network, and then even countries within that. And there's an Australia, New Zealand network. And then we're starting new networks, and we have an organization called Emerging Regions. And so all that to say, that gives you a little bit of insight in terms of, historically and where it is today. So, and essentially, here's what we're about. We're about planting more churches. We're about seeing I should say really about two things: healthy, multiplying churches. So we want healthy churches, but we want multiplying churches. Mm-hmm. And so we exist, and we're spread all over the world at this point, but our headquarters are here in the United States. We exist to see more churches planted, to see churches become multiplying churches. And probably 500 to 550, I didn't come in armed with a bunch of stats right in front of me, but 500 to 550 churches are in the United States. And then, we're growing, adding 50, 75 churches every single year outside of the United States. So, and here's the benefit for you as a local church in Gilbert, Arizona. Benefit for you is you're a part of a global, diverse family of healthy multiplying churches. So you can you've got connections locally. So you've got connections across the Western United States of churches that are theologically like you, that also care about church planting and want to see people reached and come to Christ through church planting. And then you've got many, many opportunities for global partnerships. And so we have lots of churches. Most United States churches have partnerships with other churches outside of the United States as well, so that you can really, most of us, if we've been exposed cross-culturally, we know there's great benefit in seeing what Christ is doing across the globe. And so that's another huge benefit of Acts 29.
Yeah. And I feel like we've benefited from that a lot. We had early on, when we were just thinking about planting and thinking about jumping into Acts 29, one of the books that really pushed us forward, and we've told the church to read it, at least we've asked them to, we asked them to, is Gaining by Losing by J.D. Greear, just because I feel like that there is a missional component to that Acts 29 carries, which is, hey, let's develop leaders and pastors to plant. Let's be a church planting church and give away what God's given to us. And just that idea of, as pastors, the people that God brings into our church aren't ours. We're not possessive. We in some ways we're sheep. We say we're sheep before we're shepherds. We are just a part of the body as pastors, and we unite with this church to live on mission, to preach the gospel, to raise up disciples, and to do so to, in some ways, let them go into the world, some of them on church plants, to continue to multiply what God's doing. And so you guys I love that that's a part of what we're a part of and what you guys are a part of. As you've thought about the future of Acts 29, you just took over as the executive director probably in the last month or two. It hasn't been long. You were acting. Okay. Yeah. Right in the middle of, there was nothing else going on at that time either. So everything was just calm. Sure that wasn't upheaval for you. So, but I'm sure that you have and maybe this is the board's mission and direction too, but I'm sure that you've thought about it and you've thought, where are we going to be in 5 years? What's Acts 29 doing? Like, what are we going to be growing in? What do you want to see happen? that we can be praying for, that we can be thinking through?
Well, I can think of a few things. The first thing I would say is, and it's not so much about church planting, but just maturity. I think continued maturity from our early years. So, when a church is young, when an organization is young, it oftentimes brings a particular culture. Acts 29 in its early years was known as sort of a young, flannel shirt wearing, sort of tattoo having, whatever, group of young, vigorous, argumentative, and you can fill in probably 20 other buzzwords. And uh, perhaps some of that's fair, and I'm not sure if it all is or if it isn't. I joined Acts 29 in my 30s, and I wear a flannel shirt when it's cold, but coming from Arizona, I didn't have very many of them. So, but I would say when I look at Acts 29 now, 20 years in, um, there's a lot more gray hair than there used to be. We've got younger and older, and so I think just
Right.
continued maturing from our early years. Another thing I would say is just continuing to plant healthy churches in the United States. So we can't lose that focus and mission of we're about expansion. We're about planting new churches. And I guess, and I haven't thought about this a ton prior to now, but it pops into my head like a business analogy maybe that might be helpful. If there were 500 coffee shops and you felt like, hey, we really want to get to 1,000 coffee shops, and that's our goal. I think we've got 500 churches in the United States, but more churches close than are planted oftentimes, and that statistic sways, depending on the year. But we'd like to see 500, 750, 1,000, 1,250, 1,500, 2,000, 5,000 churches, not because we want to be big in and of ourselves, but because we want to see more churches planted so that lives are changed, believing that the church is central to God's purpose. And then we're going to continue to press into growth in diversity. We've been working on that for several years, knowing that the kingdom of God is diverse, knowing that those of us that live in the Western United States experience very diverse ethnic culture so often because we're a melting pot in the Western United States. So there's amazing beauty in that. And so we want to continue to make sure that Acts 29, our church planting efforts, our churches, our leadership reflects kingdom diversity and the beauty of the Imago Dei that God's created, right? Creating every human being in the image of God. And then I've got one more thing that comes to mind, and it's continued global expansion. So we want to continue to press into planting new churches in new areas. I've traveled quite a bit. I travel internationally several times a year. And, we take for granted in Gilbert, Arizona, and Orange County, California, and other places that you may be listening from. Maybe you're listening to this podcast and you live elsewhere, but we take for granted how convenient it can be to us to even choose from a number of churches. Whereas, right now I'm one of the guys that I work with, Philip Moore, is an associate director of Acts 29. He lives about 45 minutes outside of Paris, France. And there's a train line that goes from central Paris to Euro Disney, which is Disneyland Paris. And all along that train line, there are cities, towns, 20, 25, 30,000 people. And many of those towns don't have a single church, Christian gospel preaching church in those towns. Wow. And that's Europe. That's not, we're talking about Europe that has a Christian history. And so we want to just continue to press into planting churches in hard to reach areas in Eastern Europe and South America, in emerging regions. And so those are the kinds of things: maturity, U.S. church planting, continued growth and diversity, and then continued global expansion. And you, as a church, you're a huge part of that. You need to know that, because we're a collection of churches is what we are. And so we hope you as a church will care about planting more churches and care about planting churches across the globe and care about kingdom diversity, those sorts of things. So
yeah,
I would say
good,
that's what I'm excited about the future.
Great. That's good. You mentioned, and this will probably lead us into the next question in a second, but you mentioned planting healthy U.S. churches. What's the difference between in your mind, a healthy church and an unhealthy church? Is that a leadership culture? Is that a gospel proclaiming culture? What is that? What is a healthy church?
Well, Wayne Grudem, in his book Systematic Theology, which you might have only read if you went to seminary or if you had a pastor who encouraged you to read it. But he's a theologian who lives in Phoenix, and he's done some really good writing. And he talks about true churches and false churches. He says there are true churches and there are false churches. Now, once we understand what a true church is, he says there are more pure churches and less pure churches. Pure churches. Now, we could probably talk about that and what that looks like and how you quantify that, or whether or not you even completely buy that. But I think most of us know a church where everybody's fighting, a church where leadership isn't healthy, a church where people aren't being well cared for, a church where the Bible is not opened, a church that has no theological convictions about anything. We'd say those churches probably aren't very healthy churches. Now, whether it's a true church or a false church, we could probably all give examples of false churches, churches that don't believe in Christ at all, or that wouldn't see Jesus even as God's son. We would, cults, that sort of thing. So a healthy church is a church that's going to be functioning in a way where there's a healthy leadership culture, where people are being reached for Christ, where people are being discipled, where people are growing in their faith, where people are living in community, where people are owning personal responsibility for mission, where leaders have a high character standard and are caring for people well. So those sorts of things would be healthy churches versus unhealthy churches, I guess is what I would say.
Great. And part of that goes into, you've been coaching pastors and leaders for a long time. What is it about, why is that important? And maybe you just answered it from the standpoint of just having, pastoral teams, leadership teams. I'm sure not everybody you're coaching are pastors, just leaders that are thinking through things in a strategic way, having high levels of integrity, like all of that. What is it about coaching pastors that you love, and that you found to be important? Why is that important to have pastors have somebody helping them out?
Well, let me give you two words, the word mentor and the word coach. So the word mentor is a person who's walked where you've walked before. Okay. And then coach is a person that, if we look at it almost in the secular sense, I guess, I hate to use the word secular, but a person who brings out the best in a player or a person. So a couple of years ago, I was at a carnival when my daughter was still in middle school, and they were serving Papa John's pizza, and we volunteered to help serve pizza at the local elementary school because our kids were part of it, elementary and middle school. It's a K through 8. And I struck up a friendship with a guy, or a conversation with the guy who owned Papa John's. And it turns out that he's a believer. We started talking, and he explained to me I was an accountant for 20 years, and I decided I really wanted to do something different. So I bought a Papa John's. And then he found someone to teach him how to run a Papa John's. And by the time I met him, he owned 5 Papa John's restaurants. And he was just explaining to me his journey. I think about what pastors need in mentoring. Pastors need people who have walked before them. That's what Paul was to Timothy. Paul to Timothy was a mentor. All right. Now, I guess it's fair to say Jesus was a mentor to the disciples. He was the Son of God. So maybe Paul to Timothy is a little bit better example, because I'm certainly not Jesus mentoring disciples. But I think it's really helpful for a young pastor. I had a guy named Larry Webb who planted 4 churches, who mentored me when I planted, and Doug Bookman, who was one of my college professors, and Tom Halstead, men that came alongside me who'd been where I'd been before and mentored me. Now, when you think of a coach brings out the best in a player. So when I come alongside a pastor, sometimes most often at this stage of life, because I'll be 50 years old here in a couple of months, most often I've been where he's been before, but also oftentimes it's a very gifted leader that I need to help that person lead more effectively. What's great about it is that it's needed, it's life-giving, to come alongside a teachable church leader and help that person succeed is really fantastic. So what I would say to you that are a part of Anchor Church, if you're part of the church and you're listening to this, is it's great that your pastors have prioritized having coaches and mentors. It's all a part of community ultimately. So we look at Barnabas, sort of this model for coaching, a come alongside encourager who's I used to run quite a bit. I run a little bit less these days, but imagine you going out to run a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon. I ran a half marathon one time, and having somebody right next to you saying, "You can do it. I'm going to stay with you." No, 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 you're not going to quit. That's
Hmm.
the idea of what a coach can do. Now, you may have had bad coaches in your life and good coaches in your life, but in the church world, we try to be good coaches and come alongside and encourage and also do some mentoring along the way. So that's what is needed. And that's what I'd say is so great about
That's good. Yeah. And we've benefited from that. Just in so many ways, preaching, thoughts on preaching to thoughts on, again, even just as practical things as how do we get to two services if we ever need to? I mean, like that, just small things like that. I'm more and more convinced that pastors and churches aren't experts in everything.
Yeah.
When I first became a pastor, 11 or 12 years ago, it's like, we should probably be able to do everything. Like, this is, why wouldn't we be able to do everything? And the more I'm a pastor, the more I'm like, we just don't know much. I mean, we're Bible guys, and
We're
which is
usually
good.
good at a couple things and need help in some other things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
it's been good. What are pastors and leaders? So both, we have community group leaders, we have people leading, ministry areas, we have, so pastors and leaders. What are, as you think about it in terms of just help leadership, overall, what are we missing? Like, what do we need to grow in? I think, like, as we think about it, what are the most important things for us, as given let's just say that we get the Bible right and our theology's fine. We're preaching the gospel and Jesus is the center of what we're doing. What else do we need to be growing in? Like, how do we need to be thinking about this in terms of building a church, especially church plants? Because we're a church plant, we're not even a year old. As we're thinking about it, us and then others, as we plant churches and other churches are being planted, what are some things that you feel like churches should be thinking through, and pastors and leaders?
Well, the first thing I would say, and this applies to pastors, small group leaders, any Christian leader, is don't derail your life. So pay attention to your life and teaching. So pay attention to your character and to your doctrine. Now, how do I do that? I do that by being aware of what my character is, by living in community and open honesty, by staying rooted in the scriptures. And so, no amount of strategy or leadership is going to matter if you derail your life and you make a shipwreck of your life, so to speak. So what I would like to say to leaders, first of all, if you do nothing else, is pay attention to your life and teaching. All right. And so, and again, I would say you need people in your life that will tell you the truth that you actually listen to and you don't argue back against. We have, two college students and two high school students, and we've tried to teach our kids. And if you have kids, many of you probably do, you know that this is a lesson that falls on deaf ears often. So I tell my kids, people pay me to tell them what to do for a living or to give them advice. You should listen to me. But we try to tell our kids, when we're bringing advice to you or correction to you, that's a loving thing to do. So watch your life and watch your teaching and live in community. And then I would say, I'll give you one more thing, primarily for church leaders and pastors, is sometimes we're good at the doctrine part, we're good at the shepherding part, but we're not very good at the leadership part, particularly in our theologically robust world. And so now this is not going to apply necessarily to all of you in you're a small group leader at Anchor Church Gilbert. You're a church leader, you're leading some area in the church. But for your pastors, I'm constantly trying to work with pastors and make sure that you're thinking strategically, that you're thinking this is a missions work in a local church. We're not just pastoring people day one, we're planting a new mission, which involves writing a plan and making goals, setting goals. And that's not secular. If I walked into the jungle and I said, I don't know why we always use the jungle as an analogy. If I walked into some unreached people group and I said, I want to reach these people, I would go in and I would have a plan and I would know what I was going to do and I would have a process. So I would say those two things, and we could probably talk about this for an hour, but
Mhm.
so for everybody, watch your character, watch sin patterns that creep into your life. Surround yourself with people that can tell you the truth. For church leaders, make sure that you're focusing not only on the scripture, do that, focus on your character, but make sure that you're planning well, particularly in a church plant.
Yeah, that's good. Too often, I think I love that you started with what you started with. I think too often, and we've seen it, in the church too many times, you get another email saying, "Hey, so and so is not a pastor anymore because of X, Y, and Z or whatever." Um, what is it about you? You've dealt with. I know you've dealt with a number of different people over the years, just as you've coached them and as you've talked with them. What is it about things, something like narcissism that just creeps into pastoral, I don't, maybe any leader really, as you just try to lead a church, and all of a sudden it becomes less about mission or the people, and it becomes more about you and your platform and your, what is it about that? I mean, take a shot in the dark. Like why is that why is that the case in your mind, as you've looked at, besides original sin? Like what's happening there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've thought about this for hundreds of hours, and anything I toss out here is going to be more of my opinion rather than something that's necessarily been tested objectively. But it feels like celebrity culture plays into it. We've got a really, really strong when you look back historically, we didn't have mega churches in the 60s. I think, again, I don't have this stat in front of me, but I think in 1970, they were like 2 or 3 mega churches in the whole country. There are very, very few. Churches were smaller. There weren't as many celebrity pastors. And these days, we've got much more of a celebrity pastor culture. And people want to grow big churches and establish a name for themselves and those sorts of things. So man, I think what I would say is, I'm not exactly sure why, and you might take issue with what I've even said, but it
No.
feels like if you put your head down and you plant your church, and you put your head down and you stay in the scripture, and you don't worry about how big your platform is or what God's going to do, but you do faithful ministry. We definitely have a problem in the ministry culture with leaders getting themselves in trouble, with leaders making poor decisions. I don't know if it's greater today than it has been in the past, or if it's more public today. I don't know,
Or
but I
both,
know,
yeah.
man, yeah, the hero of the faith in my mind is the guy who week in, week out opens up the scripture, teaches the Bible, loves people, develops leaders, and nobody's ever heard of that person.
Yeah.
And he
And they're
lives
just,
locally.
yeah, totally. And they're thinking through, they're thinking through strategy, but it's to reach their, I wonder if part of it has to do with just the idea that success means size, or success equals size. I don't, sometimes I've heard it both ways, because it's weird. I've heard that it can be a crutch for people that don't want to work hard. They're like, size doesn't matter. And so what they wind up doing is spending 50 hours on their sermon.
Right.
And they don't love people or don't think strategically.
Yeah.
I've also seen guys work hard at all of it, and there's churches still smaller because of the area that they're in or whatever. And so, I ultimately, like, the Lord knows, but there's something weird about success and size being linked,
Yeah.
that I just think can be a dangerous thing. Like what you just said, like, you make a name for yourself. How you do that is by growing a big church that has 7 campuses, and everybody knows the lead pastor, and you video yourself around, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I got a platform now to say what I want to say. So I don't know. Maybe I think that's one of the things I love about Acts 29, saying we want to be churches that plant other churches, because we want to be multiplying ourselves, and not in a
Right.
way to promote me, but to promote Jesus. So
Yeah.
I think those are all
Yeah.
healthy things. Um, you know, one other question for you in terms of just our church plant. Like I said, we're about less than a year in. Almost, we might celebrate our anniversary in a pandemic. Like, I have no idea. So beginning of August, we'll see how it flies.
It's going to be a Zoom anniversary.
Zoom anniversary party. Who knows? What are, we're, as we think about the next 2 or 3 years. So we're church as a church. I'm a church member first. What should we expect, anticipate, look forward to, watch out for as a church plant here in the next? And there's just the first few years of our infancy, continuing to try to reach the community. What are some things that you feel like, as you've seen it, because you've been a church planter and you've watched a lot of church plants, what are things we should be looking for, excited about, maybe some pitfalls for us. Just give me some stuff.
Well, I've got a couple things here for you to think about. First of all, realize that when we plant a church, it's not about us just huddling up and going, hey, we're a better church than every other church in town. We're the only gospel-centered church. By the way, I've never met anybody who says they're not gospel-centered as a church, but we love to say we're the only gospel-centered, so church planting is about reaching people for Christ. And so I would say, as a church plant, Anchor Church in Gilbert, you should have an awareness of how many people here don't know Jesus. It's pretty easy to figure that out. You can figure out how many churches there are and the average attendance of those churches. You can look at census data and people register. The community where I live, 6% of the people claim to be Christians, or evangelical Christians, I should say, 6%. We've got 20-something percent claim to be Catholic. 51% of the community that I live in claims no religion. It's really helpful to know that, so that you can know this is the mission field we are on here. Okay, so I know community is very important. Christian community, fellowship, building into each other's lives. That's important. But we don't do that at the exclusion of looking to reach people for Christ. We do both. We're in community on mission. And there have been good books written on that, and probably good sermons preached on that. So I would say, as a church plant, don't get too content with, we've got our 100, 125 people, whatever. No, our goal is to continue to reach people. Our goal is to bring the gospel to an area that needs it. And God has brought us here for that point. The second thing I would say is, you do need to grow as a church. You do need to grow. So sometimes church plants get to where they feel like, hey, we're great. We got 125 people. We know everybody's name. We like this. This is intimate. It's close. And I'm not trying to moralize a particular size of a local church. I am saying that a church plant, if you want to be around for a long time, you normally need to reach a particular critical mass, and particularly if you're going to pay a pastor full-time, that sort of thing. And so I would encourage you, don't settle in and go, hey, we're 9 months in, we're here. No, church planting I used to think it took 3 years. Now I realized really a church is a church plant for really probably the first 10 years. You're going through different stages of that church plant, that sort of thing. So it is important that you continue to grow and expand as a church plant, not so that you can become, world famous, but rather so that you can be a long-term sustainable presence in your community. And I'll give you one more thing is be patient, Anchor Church, with the development of long-term leaders. Okay, I coach church planters to say, do not put leaders in place too quickly. You might say, wait, we need more elders or we need more leaders. And I would say, you're like a fledgling toddler, so you're walking down the street, or I should say, you're hopefully not a toddler walking down the street, or you might get hit by a car. You're walking in the living room trying to make your way over to the coffee table, and bam, you fall, and hopefully you hit a pillow, right? And so church plants are fragile. They don't have the web of long-term relationships oftentimes, even if some of you came together to help plant this church. And so be patient, knowing that placing long-term leaders, long-term elders takes years and years. And so I oftentimes say to churches, man, no new elders for the first 3 or 4 years. And you might go, what, 3 or 4 years? But elder backlash derails church plants. So be patient in that, is what I would say.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I just think that there's so many more questions. Probably have to have you on again, because I had so many more questions about leadership and had development in Acts 29, even just even thinking about how we can get plugged in with different areas. The church, I know, was eager to do our best to provide, to help. I mean, just in terms of generously trying to give to things like church and hard places. And, we want to be able to jump in and do what we can to even just be more in partnership with A29. And I think it's encouraging having you as being the executive director, because we have a relationship with you. And we want to just know how we can further jump in and serve our partnership that we're in and continue to plant. Okay. So I'm sure that there's plenty other questions we could have for you. Where can we find you? Tell us how we can find more, hear more from you, hear more from Acts 29, what can people can subscribe to something? Is there what website can we go to just to even hear more?
Probably, I've done a lot of writing on my context staffing website. Most of it is on church staffing, church leadership. It's contextstaffing.com. I also am doing more and more writing on the Acts 29 website. So not only me, but a lot of good, there's a lot of good authors. We've got a partnership with the Gospel Coalition, and you'll see posts from Adam Ramsey and Jen Oshman and just a lot of good content. Our podcast, Tony Merida leads that, the Acts 29 podcast. I'd highly encourage you to listen to that. Also, search for us on social media. So look for Acts 29. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and you can find us pretty easily on those channels. So all that to say, I'm about what we're about, which is Acts 29. And I would say begin to follow us. So let me say one more thing here. Acts 29 is not a network of pastors. It's a network of churches. So we're not able to do a conference probably this year. But last year we had a conference of 900 people in Reno, Nevada. We've been doing it in Reno for a number of years. We were going to do it in Denver this year, and it looks like we probably won't be able to meet face to face. But I want to encourage you to come come to those. We do them for really cheap. And the goal is that we would, some churches will bring 25 people to that conference. We had 280 women last year, and only 25 of those women were pastors' wives. And so they were church leaders and women actively serving in local churches. So get involved in Acts 29 with your church and your church leadership when there are opportunities, is what I would say as well.
Good. Awesome. Well, man, grateful for you. Thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for talking to the church. I know that the church is eager to, would love to have you out sometime whenever COVID-19's not around, whenever your children let you leave, because I know they want to spend time with you. Maybe they'll kick you out after all this. Maybe you guys have been around each other too long.
Hey, we need some Arizona time. So
yeah, man. Well, probably not now. Probably like, like not October, November. Yeah. November-ish would probably be good. So,
right.
Yeah, man. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Looking forward to next week. See ya.